unusual.
Unique.
Words?
These
That were
Experiment.
bad. Other words? Must be
Many.
fun.
not too
Many.
dogs.
We knew
Guys
Was to run.
on block.
Many.
wheels
And
ears.
and rod. It's no wonder. Look, so odd.
But
One. Can't we do?
what?
Can't we do?
One. Can't we do?
Anything?
It's true.
We're
Original.
we're one up.
Kind.
We're upside down and four. Two behind.
Experiments.
This.
The only place that we could ever
We always try
to do. But sadly,
We couldn't pass that.
give us a job.
give it
Some to ask.
What?
It is. You'll be sorry that you asked it.
But
One. Can't we do?
what?
can't we do?
One. Can't we do?
Anything?
It's true.
We can't do
Anything?
That's true.
We can't do
Anything?
but we can try.
We could
give
anything.
A try. We will.
Anything.
Try. Isn't that
Right.